Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be updating my guide on Rook, the Hunkering Berserker, and so please sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Rook is an aggressive melee champion who excels in dealing good burst damage with his hammer and piece of meat. While it takes a bit of practice to master Rook, he's a fairly straightforward champion to learn to play, and so he's a pretty good champion to start with if you are learning to play a melee champion. I'd say he's just fairly beginner friendly. In terms of damage, Rook can do some massive burst damage alone if he is given the opportunity and the enemy has no escapes left, so I'd say his strengths lie in his ability to aggressively go after vulnerable enemies. Basically, Rook is like an opportunist, and a very aggressive one at that if the matchup allows for it. To help him do his job, he has some pretty decent control abilities, and he also has some good self-sustain that is built into his base kit. The downside to playing Rook is that he is often quite predictable, since there aren't that many ways for him to engage onto an enemy without putting himself in a dangerous position. So yeah, that was just a brief summary of Rook as a champion. Now I will just quickly give a rundown on how this video is structured before I get into the meat of the guide. As with my older champion guides, I have split this guide up into 5 sections, and that is abilities, playstyle, Battlerites, loadouts and team comps. I have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below, so feel free to jump directly to a certain section that you need if you wish. I'd like to point out that I do not have a gameplay tips section in my champion guides anymore, since I feel like some of the tips are quite repetitive from champion to champion, and so these little gameplay tips will instead pop up in the video when they are relevant, I suppose. And so yeah, with all that being said, let's begin. First off, abilities. Rook's most one ability is Pummel, and this is his basic melee attack. What it does is Rook will attack the target in front of him for 10 damage, and each successful hit also reduces the cooldown of Crushing Blow by 0.5 seconds. We'll get into what Crushing Blow is right after this, so pretty simple and straightforward so far, since there's no fancy weapon charge mechanics or charge attacks involved here. Moving on, Rook's most 2 ability is Crushing Blow, and this is one of Rook's main invisibility frame or iframe ability. What it does is Rook will jump into the air and then slam his mace into the ground, dealing 16 damage to all enemies in a small area in front of him, and also applying the armor break debuff to all of them. The armor break debuff increases the target's damage taken by 20% for 3 seconds, and so it is extremely useful to apply the debuff onto an enemy that you are trying to burst down together with your teammates. Because Rook is invulnerable while jumping, do take note that you can often avoid hard hitting abilities or ultimate abilities with this Crushing Blow ability. We'll go more into that later in the video. Since Crushing Blow is an iframe ability, the ability cannot be cancelled mid-cast, so do be careful as well when you choose to press on the mouse 2 button, because you wouldn't want to waste such an important ability unnecessarily. Next up, Rook's spacebar ability is his only movement ability, and it is called Rush. What it does is Rook will charge forward at high speeds after a brief cast period and slam into the first enemy that is in his way. The target will be dealt 12 to 24 damage depending on how far away they are, increasing as the travel distance increases, and the slam also stuns the target for 0.5 seconds, making it a very good way to engage onto an enemy that is weak and vulnerable, after having expended their escape cooldowns of course. Because Rook isn't invincible while charging, he can actually be interrupted or damaged mid-charge, so do watch out for enemy stuns or disables along the way if you want to make sure you hit your charge. Because Rook lets out a very distinct shout, and he has a very distinct animation as well when trying to charge, you can sometimes use this ability to easily bait enemy into using their cooldowns unnecessarily by just using it and cancelling it multiple times before actually committing to the charge. So yeah, something to keep in mind. Moving on, Rook's Q ability is Berserk, and this is his counter ability. What it does is Rook will attempt to counter the next projectile or melee attack, and if successful, Rook will become invulnerable for 1 second and gain the Berserk buff for 3 seconds. Berserk is basically a buff that increases Rook's movement speed by 50%, and his most one attack speed is also increased by 33%. This means that Rook can chase down and pummel people down very easily when he has this buff, and so that's why hitting Rook's counter is usually a very bad idea. Next up, Rook's E ability is Boulder Toss, and this is his main ranged poke ability. What it does is Rook will toss a boulder toward the target location, and upon impact this boulder will deal 16 damage to all nearby enemies and knock them back away from the center of the impact. Because this ability is an AoE ability, it's really good for poking without worrying about enemies countering it, forcing escapes, or simply zoning people away from certain areas. With the knockback effect, you can also use this ability to knock the central orb toward your team, so that's something you can do to make it easier and safer for your team to take the orb. And so yeah, those were Rook's abilities that doesn't require energy. Now let us move on to those which do. First off, Rook's R ability is Smack, and this is Rook's main hard CC ability. What it does is that Rook will smack enemies in a wide arc in front of him, dealing 12 damage while knocking back all enemies hit in the direction of the mouse when the ability was activated. Enemies knocked into a wall will be incapacitated for 2.5 seconds, allowing Rook or his teammate to easily land skill shots for a while, and so I think it's really useful. If you're not sure what the incapacitated debuff is, it is like a long stun, but it breaks if the incapped target is dealt any damage or the debuff duration itself expires. The smack arc itself is very big, and the knockback also knocks the enemy back quite a distance, so just test it out for yourself and get a good feel of it to reliably incapacitate enemies. Moving on, Rook's first EX ability is his Shift Mouse 1 ability, Eat, and this is his main sustain ability. What it does for 25 energy is Rook will eat his meat, healing himself for 16 health immediately, followed by another 24 health over 4 seconds. This ability alone can heal up the whole 40 health that you're missing up to the current max HP, so it's definitely very useful during downtime. Even when in the middle of a fight, it can be quite useful as well, since the heal over time effect should keep you in a fight for longer. In 1v1 situations, this ability is amazing for outtrading enemies, so do remember to use it whenever you see you are able to heal yourself up to your current max HP. Next up, Rook's second EX ability is his Shift Right Click ability, Meat Bolt. What it does for 25 energy is Rook will throw his meat out in the targeted direction, dealing 24 damage and snaring the target that it hits. Because Meat Bolt costs energy to use and the base mouse 2 ability is Rook's only iframe ability, this ability isn't that great for poking even though it has decent range. I suppose that if you know you don't need the base mouse 2 ability anytime soon, and you want to help out your teammate with a 2-second 50% snare onto an enemy, then go ahead and use that 25 energy to throw the Meat Bolt over, I suppose. Another good use for the ability is to finish enemies off as well, since it is a direct projectile attack, unlike Rook's E, which takes a while to land, and enemies can dodge it relatively easily. Finally, Rook's ultimate ability on the F key is Tremor, and what it does is Rook will jump into the air and slam his hammer down into the ground to deal 24 damage in a long line in front of him. Rook will do this a total of 3 times, including the first one, before the ability ends, and the damage from each strike increases by 6 each time, and this means that Rook will do 24 plus 30 plus 36 damage, which is a total of 90 damage. While jumping, Rook is immune to damage, but when he's on the ground for a while to do the attack, he can be stunned, damaged and all that stuff, so enemies can time their attacks well, can still do something to you if they wish. Bear in mind that the ultimate ability deals AoE damage, so this damage cannot be countered. Depending on matchups, you may or may not have enough energy to use the ultimate ability, since you might need to use most of your energy on healing with the AX Mouse 1 ability if you don't have a support teammate. It is usually inevitable that you receive some damage when playing as a melee champion after all, and so using the EX Mouse 1 to heal is quite crucial for sustaining Rook's health bar. Not to mention, you should also be trying to incap your enemies as often as you can with your R ability as well, and so it can sometimes be quite hard for Rook to save up energy for the ultimate ability. But when you can get enough energy to use his ultimate though, I'd say it's pretty worth it at the right moments, because getting at least 2 hits off is very worth it already in my opinion. And so yeah, that's about it for Rook's abilities. Now let us move on and talk a little bit about his playstyle. Rook's playstyle is a bit of an aggressive one. He really has to keep trying to get close to his enemies and time his Q or counter ability properly to really allow him to deal meaningful damage. After charging in and dealing as much damage as he can, he'll then have to wait for his cooldowns a little bit before trying to do that again. When playing as Rook, you'll typically use your E to poke a little bit here and there while waiting for a chance to charge in with his spacebar ability. Hitting Rook's spacebar onto an enemy usually at least guarantees at least one basic mouse 1 hit, or you can usually start off with a mouse 2 right on top of the enemy if you think that you wouldn't need to save it to avoid some big ability in the near future. When you're up against other melee champions, you can usually time the mouse 2 in such a way where you avoid one of their abilities while hitting them with the mouse 2 as well, so do take note of that. At this point, after charging into an enemy, hitting them with either a mouse 1 or mouse 2, if you think they're going to hit back instead of jumping away, then using his Q would be a good choice to try to get that berserk buff so that you can dish out more damage. This will be a typical game plan when trying to go on the offensive, and when you're not trying to go on the offensive, then you can just maybe heal up with Rook's EX Mouse 1 or something and wait for more opportunities to be offensive. Even though Rook has pretty good self-sustain in his EX Mouse 1, he does need energy for it and they don't come free, so definitely try to take every opportunity you can get to be aggressive and apply some pressure onto the enemy. Another way to engage if you don't want to use a spacebar is to position yourself very far forward and just try to be a bait basically. Time your Q properly, and you can use that 1 second of invulnerability to just run at the enemy basically. You should try to do this if you think the enemy has an escape cooldown ready, since if you do this, you can now use your spacebar ability to catch up to them after they have jumped. Alternatively, you can use your spacebar and then cancel it at the last second to try to bait out their escapes before actually rushing onto them. After you realize you've run out of steam and cannot deal too much damage anymore, you can try to incapacitate an enemy with your R ability if there's a wall nearby. If you're in a good position and you still have your cooldowns up and ready, it can be worth it to incap the enemy first as well, since you can give your teammates some time to set up some damaging combos together with you. During this time, your E should be off cooldown and you can easily get in some free damage this way as well. If the situation allows for it, you can even press on the attack. Otherwise, just take it slow for a bit, recharge your cooldowns and try to find chances to be aggressive again. That's pretty much it actually for Rook's playstyle. Very straightforward and simple, and that's why he's quite beginner friendly. I know I haven't talked about his ultimate ability in this playstyle section, but that's because I think I've covered enough in the ability section already for his ultimate ability, so yeah. Admittedly, it might be tough to avoid damage as melee, and you always have to weigh up the costs of charging in and all that, but at least the general playstyle of the champion is simple enough that more energy can be spent thinking about positioning, managing your health bar and all that, instead of figuring out how you want to best use your abilities as Rook. And so yeah, that's about it for Rook's playstyle. Now let us move on to Rook's Battlerites options and loadouts. Because there are so many Battlerites currently and it will take me a long while to go through and describe all of them one by one, I will just display them here, and if you wish, you can go ahead and pause the video to slowly read through them before continuing with the video. And so pause now to read through the first half. And now again for the second half. Okay, now that you've read all of them, let's continue. First off, I think that there are a couple of Battlerites that are really good and you should heavily consider having them in your build most of the time. They're by no means must pick 100% of the time, but it's probably something quite close to that I feel. These Battlerites are Frenzy and to a lesser extent Squash. Frenzy is in my opinion a must-pick Battlerite for Rook because it just offers too much offensive value. Just simply hitting your spacebar onto a vulnerable target means that you can potentially deal 30 to 40 damage within that 1.5 seconds of Berserk, so it's definitely a very useful Battlerite in all situations. Even if you hit the charge on someone with an escape ready, you're threatening to deal so much damage with this Battlerite that the enemy is forced to deal with you somehow or use their escape to jump away. On to Squash. The reason why I think it's an amazing Battlerite is because the stun helps a little bit to set up for Rook's Smack or R ability, as well as your teammates' abilities. Not only that, Rook's only way of stopping channeling ultimates is his spacebar ability, and so having an extra stun to disrupt enemies, whether it be channeling ultimates or other key abilities, is super awesome, so that's why I take Squash almost all the time. For the remaining 3 Battlerites slots, you can fill them up with Battlerites that you may need depending on the team composition you're facing, whether it be damage, survivability, or control. If you feel you need more damage or aggressiveness on Rook, Rook Smash, Endurance, and Crumble are some good Battlerites to pick up. Rook Smash is good in general, since hitting your mouse tools after charging is usually not too hard. 6 damage is 6 damage, and so it's hard to go wrong here if you have nothing else better to use. Endurance is a good Battleright for a more aggressive playstyle, since you can have your spacebar up more often if you happen to miss with it. Whilst most people are usually prepared and ready to dodge your spacebar, if you use it before they expended their cooldowns, having the Endurance Battleright means that your spacebar will be ready much quicker than the enemy's jumps, and so you can quickly close the gap once again and hopefully try to do some more damage before their escapes are ready again. It makes an already aggressive Rook even more aggressive, and so I think it's a pretty good ride to pick up against those champions with multiple escape options like Xander, Ashka, and so on. On to Crumble, I think that it is a good Battlerite to have for more damage. It's because your range poke ability now applies armor break, and it also deals 2 bonus damage. The 2 bonus damage isn't exactly major, but the big thing here is the armor break, since the enemies who have armor break on them will take more damage from your allies' attack as well. Even if you are not attacking the enemy, applying armor break on the enemy from afar means that your ranged allies will have an easier time taking them down, and so this Battlerite is really good for times when you need the extra damage onto the enemy. If you feel you need more survivability, Weapon Break and Giant are some good Battlerites to pick up. The 33% weakened effect that you can get from Armor Break when you pick up the Weapon Break Battlerite is extremely useful for winning trades, so definitely pick it up when you know you'll be trading hits with other melee champions quite often. This Weapon Break effect applies to all your Armor Break effects, regardless of the source, and so having the increased damage dealt to enemies and their damage to you is reduced by 33% is amazing. As you can imagine, having Crumble and Weapon Break together makes for a fun combo of damage and debuffs, so that's perhaps something you can go for if you like. Next up, Giant is a good survivability Battlerite for Rook since you not only deal a lot of damage during Berserk, you also take less damage during Berserk now. This Battlerite coupled with Rook's already good self-sustain built into his EX-1 makes Rook very good at surviving a lot of engagements, especially when charging in with spacebar and getting that Berserk buff from the Frenzy Battlerite I mentioned earlier. It's even better if you manage to counter an attack, since the Berserk buff you get from successfully countering lasts for 3 seconds instead of just 1.5 seconds. If you find yourself having troubles closing the gap or to stay close to enemies or simply need a bit more control, then Madness, Warcry and Crack could be some good options as well. Madness gives you another good alternative for engaging, since you can try to counter a range attack and run straight toward your enemies with that increased movement speed. If you are already close and enemy triggered your counter, they will find it extremely hard to get away from you if you have this Battlerite, so this could be something you might want to try to do as well. Warcry isn't that amazing if you ask me, but it can be a pretty good option sometimes depending on your team comp, since you can use it to combo with teammates as well. Take note that it is a 50% snare for 3 seconds, meaning that the snare factor doesn't reduce over 3 second duration. Having your enemy's movement speed slowed by 50% for 3 seconds is pretty amazing for setting up your teammates' AoE abilities, and so it can be pretty good in some niche situations. And finally, Crag is a decent control Battlerites for Rook as well, because the fading snare and cooldown reduction really helps Rook out when he's up against multiple ranged enemies and has to rely on his E a bit more for chip and poke damage. And so yeah, those Battlerites are some of the better Battlerites available to Rook. The remaining Battlerites, that is Pummel Rush, Raging Bull and Earthquake, just aren't that great to me, at least in the current patch. Pummel Rush used to be great Battlerites, but with the recent nerf to Rook's -1 energy gain and the new Endurance Battlerites, Pummel Rush isn't that needed in my opinion, and so I feel there are better Battlerites to take instead of it. Raging Bull sounds good in theory, since the cooldown reduction for Rush sounds pretty good, but it seems like it is mostly the same as Endurance. So I suppose if you can always proc your counters, then it might be okay, but with that said, I mostly just prefer the guaranteed benefits of Endurance as compared to Raging Bull. Onto the cast time reduction component of the Battlerites, I think that it makes it quite a bit harder for you to bait enemy cooldowns and for you to aim your spacebar properly so that you can actually hit your enemy. I suppose you could practice the timing and get used to it and all, but I think it's much better to have the normal cast time just so you can be a bit more unpredictable and do some flick charges instead of having a fast charge. I feel that a flick charge is more unpredictable than a fast one, so that's why I feel Raging Bull isn't as necessary. And finally, as with most Battlerites that improve ultimates, Earthquake is rather lackluster as well. Rook's abilities that require energy are all pretty useful, and so getting enough energy for an ultimate is already hard enough usually. To make matters worse for the Battlerites, Armor Break is already quite easily applied if you have the Crumble Battlerites. Tremor giving Armor Break just doesn't feel useful enough in my opinion, and so I'd suggest avoiding this Battlerites if possible. So yeah, those were my thoughts on most of the Battlerites for Rook. Like I mentioned in my beginner tips video, I think you want to at least give a little bit of thought about the Battlerites that you're using before each round, since that is a good way of understanding the champion more, and it'll help with making sure you learn what are the best situations to use which rights and so on. But in case you want to just quickly take a loadout and jump straight into a game, here are some loadouts that I use. To start off, here's the standard build I take most of the time. As I mentioned earlier, I take Squash and Frenzy most of the time, so here they are. Giant together with the Weapon Break and Crumble combo makes this build a sort of safe build, and so you should be pretty okay in most matchups with this build. Just pick your engagements correctly, be unpredictable, and you should do pretty well with Rook with this build I think. If you want to opt for a more aggressive approach to playing Rook, then you could perhaps swap out Weapon Break and Giant for Rook Smash and Endurance. This allows for a more aggressive playstyle, but you do sacrifice a little bit of survivability. Against multiple ranged enemies, swapping out Crumble in the previous aggressive build for Crag could be good, since you have shorter cooldowns on both your spacebar and E abilities, which are the most useful abilities Rook has against ranged enemies. And so yeah, that's about it on Rook's Battlerites and Loadouts. That was a fairly lengthy part, but we'll now move on to champions that synergize with Rook before we finish the guide with some final notes on Rook. On team compositions, I find that Rook synergizes well with range or support champions, slightly more so than melee champions, simply due to the fact that melee champions often get in the way with each other when in melee range. Support and ranged champions can benefit from the amount of space that Rook can create for them, and so that's why he's naturally pretty good with other ranged teammates I think. Rook's relatively easy to use in-cap ability is also perfect for setting up some of the harder hitting ranged abilities, and so that's very useful as well. Even if Rook doesn't have a support teammate, he can still sustain himself quite well, and so being with a ranged teammate is fine as well, as long as Rook peels for them here and there and try to draw fire away from them as much as possible. In 3 vs 3s, Rook might have a bit of issue with his lack of mobility and iframes, but if he plays with his team and plays it smartly, he can still be a decent asset to the team I think, since he applies a lot of pressure by just being there and can still chase down vulnerable lone enemies quite easily. And so yeah, that's about it for my Rook guide. I hope you guys found it useful. The next 2 guides coming up would be on Jamila and then Croak. So if you guys would like to vote on which champion guide you'd like me to update next after Croak's guide, go ahead and click on the I button at the top right now. That's about it for this video, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as well. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave any questions or thoughts in the comment section below, share this video with your friends, and you can check out my other videos as well if you haven't already. I stream 3 days a week on Twitch nowadays as well, so do check me out at twitch.tv/Chyill if you're into watching people play Battlerite live. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.